Welcome you all to the Center as the director of our Environmental Change and Security Program, a program that has really tried to grapple with the very issues that we're looking at today, water and conflict, and in a broader context, environment, development, health, in a foreign policy and a security policy context. So obviously, this really tremendous effort by Catholic Relief Services to wrap their arms around what you will see is a highly complex set of issues around water conflict, but also incorporating peacebuilding into water development, not just about the threat, but the opportunity to respond. Let me just say a word about the Wilson Center as a welcome. There are some new faces in the room, and apologies. We had a tremendous response to this, so those of you in the overflow room, our apologies, but the insights will be just as scintillating, I'm certain, from there as well. The Wilson Center is the former memorial to Woodrow Wilson. So instead of building an obelisk on the mall, we're actually a living memorial where the worlds of scholarship and policy come together. Wilson was our only president to have a PhD, and it honors both of his legacies as scholar and politician. We are fortunate to have former Congressman Lee Hamilton as our president and director. So on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis, we try to bring groups together like the one we have in the room today, the ones that we have watching online, and the ones we have watching certainly on C-SPAN. It's a terrific opportunity to share these insights because, as I said, I think Catholic Relief Services has done us a tremendous service by trying to take a stab at wrapping arms around an enormous topic and doing both problem identification, but also ways forward and proactive ways forward for a humanitarian organization, one that I think will have real impact that goes beyond just a given organization. So what I'm going to do is turn the floor over to Dennis Warner with Catholic Relief Services. Dennis is going to kick us off and walk us through the program. So Dennis, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Dennis Warner. I'm the Senior Water Advisor for Catholic Relief Services. Let me just, and I'll be the moderator for this meeting today. Let me start off by saying if there are people that don't have seats and need seats, there is a room one floor down at this end of the circular walkway with a video feed where you can sit and watch and hear the panel in perhaps a bit more comfort. But it's your choice. At this point, I'd like to ask Ken Hackett, the president of Catholic Relief Services, to make some remarks to you. Ken is the head of an organization which is one of the largest humanitarian relief and development organizations in the world. In his role, he oversees activities in 100 countries and with a staff of approaching 5,000 people. Ken became president in 1993 and has been with us since then. Ken?
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you to the Wilson Center. This is an honor and a pleasure. It's a great turnout here today. I want to start by recognizing one of our board members, Tricia Broglie, for coming over and being with us. That's support from the top. This morning, or this afternoon, this conversation on water and conflict, I think is going to be most interesting. I don't consider myself in any way expert in the topics, so what do you do if you're not an expert? You Google it. So I Googled water and conflict, and I came across something from the Pacific Institute, which maybe many of you know already, but it was the Water Conflict Chronology. And it lists hundreds of events of conflict related to water, from big things like river in China and conflict there, to smaller things like conflict around some wells in eastern Ethiopia, local spats. There's a lot of study that has gone into that. In our own work at Catholic Relief Services, we've come to realize that interventions related to potable water or water for irrigation or even fishing, when I lived in the Philippines in the lagoon near Manila, it's all divided up, many of you have probably seen it, on little plots that become very contentious, and that's where you put your fish traps. And as water becomes more scarce, it's conceivable that these conflicts will increase in the years ahead. From my personal experience, 40-something years ago as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana digging wells, I can tell you, and many of you already know it, that in a rural community, the issue of where the well is becomes a passionate item, particularly for the women who have to go the distance to carry the water. We believe that greater efforts must be made to understand the causes of such conflicts related to water, and to prevent disagreements from escalating into violence. I would suggest that for the humanitarian community, the development community, or other actors who are intervening on water programs, whether you're an engineering firm or whatever, we have to focus greater attention, apply better knowledge, more analysis to identifying emerging disagreements, and then figure out ways to mitigate them before they explode. Water disputes that can start at the local level, small, little things, have the potential, in extreme cases, to burgeon into something much bigger. And I don't have to tell you where those examples are. At Catholic Relief Services, we have come to realize that we must, in a proactive way, incorporate peacebuilding methodologies in our water and our sanitation work. Initiatives involving water must always, we realize now, be conflict sensitive. Some quick guidelines for such an approach are included in this new publication that you can pick up outside, Water and Conflict, which you'll hear more about this morning or this afternoon. AID helped us a bit with it in some of the costs, but we put together with a bunch of collaborators at Catholic Relief Services. So I'm delighted to be here today for what should be a very stimulating discussion with a panel that includes leading voices from USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, from Georgetown University's Program on Conflict Resolution, and of course, the Woodrow Wilson Center and its staff. Thank you and welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Ken. The process we will follow here is I'm going to introduce the three panelists to you. They will give their remarks. 15 minutes each, please, gentlemen. Because we want to have questions and comments from you, the audience. So be thinking about things that are relevant to the topic we're dealing with today. The first speaker will be Jason Gehrig, who is a water engineer working with the Tarrant Regional Water District in Fort Worth, Texas. Jason served 8 years with Marino lay missioners as an engineering advisor to the Bolivian NGO Suma Jaima. He's worked closely with the indigenous peoples of the Andes, focusing on issues ranging from the implementation of rural and semi-urban community water and sanitation projects to challenging the imposed privatization of urban water services. Jason is the lead author of the document that was available outside, Water in Conflict, Incorporating Peacebuilding into Water Development. The second speaker will be William Hall, who is an adjunct professor in the Conflict Resolution Program at Georgetown University. His teaching and research interests include the dynamics of environmental negotiation and the environmental and economic results of environmental conflict resolution. He also serves as a staff facilitator and mediator for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center. Our third speaker will be Tjip Walker, who leads the warning and analysis team in the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at the U.S. Agency for International Development. In this capacity, Tjip coordinates CMM's leadership on a range of conflict-related issues, including early warning, assessment, training, and monitoring and evaluation. He also serves as USAID's lead on fragile states. In that capacity, he recently headed a multi-year, multi-donor collaboration sponsored by the OECD Fragile States Group, which focused on improving service delivery in fragile states. With that, I'll ask Jason Gehrig to give his presentation. Be sure you give your name when you first start.
Walias Guru Hilatanaka Kuyakanaka. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Jason Gehrig. Today is a special date for me. It was exactly 10 years ago today that my wife and I landed in El Alto, Bolivia, one of the world's highest cities up in the Andean highlands. That's where we proceeded to make our lives out there in the outskirts of this impoverished city for the next 7.5 years. The focus of my talk is going to be an overview of this book that I had the opportunity to write with many good people from CRS and others. Now I'll go ahead and intertwine a few stories of my own experience with water and sanitation work in the Bolivian Andes. I think it's important to give just a quick overview of the context in Bolivia over the last decade. It's been living through a tremendous historical period in which the majority indigenous have been able to achieve power. And as you can imagine, this hasn't come easily. It wasn't unusual at all to find highways being blockaded for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. Generally peaceful, but often met with tremendous brutality by government forces of order. 2 of those were induced by water-related issues. Another one, the gas war in El Alto 2003, left 60 of our fellow El Alto residents murdered in cold blood. I bring this up because we were able to continue with water development efforts in the Altiplano despite that. The Peace Corps volunteers have been pulled out in 2002, just being 2/10 of an area. I bring that up as well because it made me as an engineer realize we can't just be looking at development without also looking at some of the structural issues at play. Let's see. My slideshow can catch up with me. The next topic. First of all, I'd like to thank some key people. Obviously, CRS. They gave me free rein on this book. No topic was taboo. Obviously, with water and conflict, there are tremendous, powerful interests at play. And so, because of that, there's an integrity with this book, speaking of truth, that I think makes it a very valuable resource. Likewise, I'd like to thank Fordham. It was during my 1.5 years there, the academic resources, the time, that I was able to write this book. The Marino lay missioners for the opportunity to be in mission, to be with the poor in El Alto, who trained us, who challenged us to remember that not so much of what we accomplish, but how we accomplish it being essential. Finally, my wife, what I like to consider my 1.5 year sabbatical while I wrote this story, she was actually working her tail off, teaching 900 kids a week Spanish in 3 different schools in the Bronx. So without these people, it wouldn't have been possible. Let's get into the book. The first part of the book is in a background. It's intended to serve the development community, human rights advocates, who so often are called to wear so many different hats, from grant writing to community organizing to being technical gurus. And so it's intended. What we did there is we brought together some wonderful research by academics, institutions, development agencies, and try to make it more accessible in one location. We addressed how this issue of that grinding poverty, that lack of access, as being this key issue of structural violence that any water and sanitation effort will be addressing. Also, as Ken mentioned, this increase in water scarcity that we're likely going to be a catalyst for increased violence on the local levels. The book then gets into the various underlying causes of water conflict, multiple, and what I'll do at this point is just go into one of them that we lived through. Shortly after arriving to Bolivia, we were sent down to Cochabamba to learn Spanish. Now, I could barely even say the word agua, much less understand why thousands of people were descending upon the city square there. But it didn't take much to realize that these people were mad as hell, that their water services have been privatized, that many of the neighborhoods have been served by cooperatives, the irrigators, who in the past had access to water. All of a sudden, we're going to have to start paying for access to that aquifer. A guaranteed profit of 13 or 16%. This isn't advancing. Wouldn't that be nice these days to have that kind of guarantee for us? That was shortly lived. Within 6 months, it fell apart. In 2005, up in El Alto, we lived through a very similar revolt up in El Alto. Again, the water services have been privatized, and the people, after 8 years have had enough. I was living there on the outskirts with people that are making $2 a day, and they were being expected to pay $450 for a water service connection and sewer connection. That's about the equivalent of 9 months' worth of income. As you can imagine, it wasn't so pro-poor as some of the studies were claiming. The next part of the book gives us a basis. If we really are serious about wanting to promote peace building in this water and sanitation field. And so there's some heartening efforts on the international level. This move toward promoting water as a human right, access to safe water as a human right. The wisdom of the indigenous peoples, there in the Altiplano amongst the Aymara, they considered water, as the veins of the Mother Earth, the Pachamama. And so how it just didn't make any sense as choque entre culturas, entre cosmovisions, of how taking this water is so key to their whole understanding of relationship with the natural world, and then for some to make a profit off of it. Gender and water issues, how can it be that half of humanities whose lives are so intertwined with water, and yet at the same time are so systematically removed from any decision-making related to it? Also, today, it's wonderful to see from various faith traditions, the contributions, and coming from a Catholic background, tapping the Catholic social teaching that's been out there. As the book progresses then, and then before we start, thinking we're going to go out there and fix other people's problems, we need to be in touch with our own issues, our own motivations, personal, organizational. We need to be that which we promote, which we strive to promote for others. Then it challenges those who are more technically oriented, like myself, an engineer, to look beyond just tubes and tanks. I can't tell you how excited it was to first build those tanks and see that water flowing out of those tap stands. But then I quickly realized, the technical dimensions of these projects are not all that complicated. It was the social organizing side. And then with time I came to realize, we shouldn't be looking at that as just another obstacle to overcome to make a successful project. But rather, through that social organizing, we can be building that social infrastructure, strengthening those existing networks that can handle future conflicts on the local level. A quick story in Puerto Costa. I hit the ground running. Thankfully, I was put in touch with some good people when we first arrived. And this is a municipality out near the Peruvian border, remote area. And I was put in touch with the water superintendent out there. And within a year and a half time, we were able to install, say, a half a dozen community systems. We were learning as we went along, making sure that we secured that issue, that water supply source, before we even began the survey. Making sure that the community members sacrificed, that they provide the manual labor. There, we even had them pay, a half month's worth of their income toward materials, so that when it was all said and done, it wasn't a handout. It was a true effort amongst partners. Unfortunately, what happened was a political maneuvering. After about a year and a half, there was a power play. This municipal jurisdiction involved about 138 villages, and half of them began to support a different man for the mayor. When I was going out there, my water superintendent buddy often was out already in villages lobbying on behalf of the current mayor. It came to a head for me personally when one time the architect threw me on the back of the mayor's motorcycle, took me out to one of the larger communities that didn't have water, that was waffling in its support, and had me poke around, looking around the water. There was absolutely no follow-up. What I came to realize is that the mayor was sending a clear message to the people. If you want the gringos with the money, you keep me in power. And that crossed the line for me, this idea of being used. And I bring this up not just as a rookie mistake, which it was, but because I think this is a dilemma that we in the international community face. So often the funds that we bring do come with strings attached, whether the political agenda, whether there's economic interests at play. Then we're there in the local area with some of that homegrown corruption issues at play as well. So we got to have our core values in place if we're going to be able to navigate that correctly. In the wake of that El Alto gas war, as I was telling you, one aid agency's bulletin was putting forth. They're proud of the fact that with their food aid, they were able to calm down the situation. What happened to listening to the valid demands of the people? Looking at the legitimate causes that caused them to lead those blockades in the first place. Is that peace building? I think if we ask the poor who we are supposedly serving, I think they'd tell you no. As Martin Luther King said, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. The book then provides a kind of a breakout, an umbrella, giving some direction on how we want to orientate our peace building and water efforts, looking at those root cause social justice issues, promoting relationship building in areas where there's historical tension amongst peoples, institutional development. I just don't think we can promote local leadership, local decision making enough, and then have, be willing to step back and let them flourish. We've been touching on a little bit of this appropriate development approach as well. Following Puerto Costa, I was put in touch with a group of young Aymara-speaking waterworks specialists called Sumahaima. What we were able to do with that independence and the trust they had built with their funders is go into these local municipalities, because it was key that the local governments participated. It's their responsibility. But by using this outside funding as leverage, saying, you put your funds in place and you do it right, we'll bring in ours, and removing that way too prevalent conflict-inducing corruption from the process. And we were able to do that successfully. And when municipalities weren't willing to work along, to do that, we'd give them what we called a time to mature. We'd basically tell the villagers, look, we'd love to help you out, but your elected officials aren't ready to do things right. And we'd move on to another municipality, always letting them know that if they could put that pressure on their officials to think otherwise, and in fact, some of them did, that we would come back and do it. So again, just one example of how water development can address various issues related to conflict. The second last section of the book was prepared by Mark Rogers. It's geared for folks who are intentionally going into areas where existing water conflict exists and using these water transformation tools and techniques to help you guide that process. Now, I say it's for those folks intentionally going in, but any of us who've worked out in the field know that almost any water effort is going to involve conflict. I've almost had, an international bicycling event be canceled because of one water system I was working on. I can tell you just numerous stories with the little conflicts flaring up with water development, but we'll save that for another day, I suppose. Finally, the book gets into concrete action steps. Dennis was telling me, he says, Jason, we're engineers. These lofty ideas of peace building, we need things to be tangible, things that concrete that we can really enact. And so we looked at some of the more typical examples of water conflict out there. Quantity and quality of water issues between upstream and downstream communities. The issue of mining, I'll touch on that in a second. Meeting the water and sanitation needs of internally displaced persons and refugees. I bring up this issue of mining because this is truly a life and death issue. In El Salvador, 3 community leaders were assassinated just in the last half year. And their crime was, to demand ecological sustainability from the mining operation. And if that mining operation couldn't do it, then to ban it outright. In this case, it was Pacific Rim's proposed El Dorado mine in Salvador. This young woman here killed, 2 weeks ago, Dora Alicia Racino Sorto, 8 months pregnant, carrying a 2-year-old, coming back from the river, having done her laundry, shot in cold blood. If we're serious about peace building and water, we need to be at the side of these people, demanding that things be ecologically sustainable. I was asked to suggest some additional areas of further study beyond what we touched with this book. I think some more of those concrete water scenarios, especially in Africa and Asia context, would be well worth it. Reading the signs of the times with the water, the war zones with non-state actors and these development efforts, trying to, what can be done there, what's working. My hat's off to folks who are trying. This issue of addressing water contamination, as we continue to make some headway about getting more access to safe water, we need to be looking at the issue of how do we continue to make water a truly renewable resource. And that's going to involve addressing contamination issues. It's going to be expensive, technically challenging, but it's necessary. And then again, other success stories from the Base. What's working out there. Not grand schemes from here up above at the center of power, but from the edges. To conclude, basically, to truly be builders of peace, we need to be able to listen and winning over hearts and minds. Not necessarily the people we serve, but our own. And we can do that by getting close to the people. so that their struggle for life, for human dignity, and for peace becomes our own. Thank you very much.
Happy New Year, everyone. I suppose it's not too far into the new year. I can still say that. Very happy to be here today. My name is Will Hall. I'm here representing Georgetown University today. I'm an adjunct faculty there in the conflict resolution program. I want to thank Catholic Relief Services for inviting me to be here today, and also the Wilson Center for sponsoring what I think is a very important panel discussion. I'm mindful that I'm wearing 3 other hats in addition to my Georgetown hat today. As was mentioned, I work for the Environmental Protection Agency, and they're supportive of me being here, but I do need to say that anything I say is not going to be reflective necessarily of official views of the agency. My second additional hat, like Ken, I was a Peace Corps volunteer not quite so long ago, about 20 years ago, in Congo. It was Zaire at the time. And so this topic definitely resonates with me as a water development practitioner from that time. I remember very well the women and children climbing long distances up hills, usually to get water from uncapped springs, and bathing in water that I captured off my roof in a 55-gallon drum. And I hesitate to think about what that might have been used for before I was using it for bathing water. But perhaps most importantly, and finally, I come here today as a human being who is deeply concerned about the state of the environment on our planet and the consequences for a lot of the people, our fellow travelers. And so that's why I think this kind of discussion is a good step forward in dealing with those kinds of issues. Reviewing the Water and Conflict document prompted a number of ideas for me. I'll share a few of those with you in general, and then delve into some specific questions that resonated with me as I was going through the document. The first of those is, why didn't I have access to something like this when I was out there in the developing world working? I do think it's got a lot of value. It's very accessible. I think people in a number of different audiences will be able to understand it and appreciate the content. NGOs, community leaders, development workers, government agencies as well. I think they can all find something important there. It's very activist and it's very passionate, and I do think that's important given the gravity of the situations that we're facing on water and conflict. I particularly appreciated the specific examples that were offered. They were all very concrete and very detailed. They bring to life, I think, the principles and practices that are being advocated. 3 specific things that I wanted to mention and highlight as important. The value of in-depth and participatory social context analysis. Getting people involved in analyzing the situation that they're facing. It's critically important. Involving as many stakeholders as possible, including those that are marginalized that may not be obvious on the face of it. And the use of neutral parties where appropriate. These people trade by different names, but it can be very helpful, as I'll mention here in some of my other remarks. My last general comment is about the breadth of the territory that the publication covers. It's very broad. And rather than being a weakness, I think this is a strength because this is a multifaceted area that we're all involved in dealing with water issues. And it's a reflection of the wide range of challenges that we face. But my attention was particularly drawn to the part of the document dealing with peace building, the tools and techniques, because that's really where I come from as a practitioner and as a researcher. And these are the questions that came to mind that I'd like to address at least partially in the forum here today. I'm going to talk about environmental conflict resolution, which is sort of my word for peace building. And it's a broad term. It covers a lot of territory from mediation to community involvement to other sorts of things. And I'll just speak about it sort of in the very, very general terms. And these thoughts are hardly comprehensive for the last word on the topics, but they're really intended to complement the ideas in the CRS publication. I'll refer to a few selected research and evaluation efforts. These are not without caveats. All research has caveats, or should, and I'll just offer them for your consideration. The first question I'd like to address is when is a situation ripe for ECR? What's the right response at a particular moment in time? There's a lot of answers to this. What I find particularly helpful is some work by Adam Curl, who is a Quaker, a Scottish peacemaker, and John Paul Lederach, in his book on building peace, actually highlighted this particular graphic, and I'll just share a little bit with you about it. Essentially, it suggests that conflict is a dynamic situation, and it has a progression, we hope, from a situation where power is unbalanced, awareness of the conflict is low, to a situation that's more peaceful and sustainable peace. Not always an easy path to get there. At first, people may not even know that they're in a conflict situation, situations of structural violence, things of that sort. They're just not aware, and awareness needs to be raised before people can even be aware of it. Then there comes a time, once awareness is raised, it's high awareness, of confrontation. And that confrontation can be very necessary in order to get to a place where the power is balanced and the people can engage in environmental conflict resolution or conflict resolution of any sort. It often takes the form of negotiation, but it can be mediation. It can be a whole range of other things. And only by balancing the power and getting through some sort of negotiation is it possible to get to sustainable peace. That's the idea that Adam Curl had. It's always resonated with me. And it suggests that at these different stages there are different roles that are particularly important. In an education role, you're going to need advocacy, awareness raising. Confrontation as well, an advocacy role is important as well. I noted in the CRS document that's highlighted as an important component. And only then can you get to negotiation where roles of peacemaker, negotiator, things like that can be particularly useful. This is a dynamic model, so it's possible to go forward and backward. What is the goal of ECR? So some sort of ECR is feasible. If we've gotten to that place where the power is relatively balanced, advocacy has been done, what is the goal? It's important to think about goals not only in terms of the substantive outcomes, building infrastructure, wells, or capping springs, or building latrines, the kind of things I was involved in, but also how people will be involved. And I want to share with you sort of a version of a chart. I won't go into huge detail on this. From the internet, it's adapted from the International Association of Public Participation. It's on their website, a version of it's on their website. And it basically talks about, as decision makers, as interveners, as people involved in these environmental conflict situations, it's extremely important to say what goal we're working towards and be clear about that with the people who are involved. Is it outreach? Where we're simply providing information? Is it information exchange where we're trying to get some back and forth but not necessarily agreement or consensus? Do we move into recommendations where people are advising on a decision or in fact trying to reach an agreement among themselves with the decision maker? Or in fact, are we engaged here in stakeholder action where we're trying to get the stakeholders to do the things they need to do themselves? And for each of these goals, there's a purpose and a promise. And the promise needs to be kept. One of the things I've learned from government work is sometimes people make promises they don't necessarily keep. And it's very, very important in these very sensitive issues and sensitive areas to be sure that you're true to that promise all along the way, to state it up front and be clear about it as you go through. What gets ECR started? Probably a lot of answers to this one too, but I'll share a little bit about my own research. I looked at 29 environmental negotiations, mostly from North America, and was interested in the dynamics of the negotiations. What gets them started? What carries them forward to conclusion? I had a bit of a model that I adapted from work by Dan Druckmann and also the late Jim Lowy, who was out at George Mason before his death. Essentially, I was looking at turning points, the changes that occur in the dynamics of a negotiation, and the precipitants of those turning points, in particular the roles that might precipitate change, and the kind of procedural or substantive activity that was going on. Turning points lead either toward agreement or away from agreement, and they in turn have procedural and substantive consequences. So I was interested in this to see, whether first of all, I could apply the framework, but also what it might reveal about, in particular, the different roles that might be played. So here's what I found out. It turns out that to get a negotiation started, to get an ECR process started, if we want to broaden it a little bit, it's procedural and external roles that make a difference. Procedural and external roles. That showed up very clearly in my data. And for purposes of this forum, I went back and looked at just the cases that were water related, and it showed up there too. So I considered it a pretty strong result. External roles here are people who are either process experts, like mediators, or people who have an influence otherwise on one of the parties. Sometimes it may not be a friendly thing, as a judge making a decision on something, but it's nonetheless something that changes the calculation for folks to move things forward. And I think this is important because it speaks to the power of process when these are process interveners, but it also speaks to other kinds of influence that can have an impact on environmental issues getting resolved. And just incidentally, the last turning point, it's more substantive, and the parties and the stakeholders themselves that are typically engaged in bringing a situation to closure. What makes ECR work? My colleagues, Kirk Emerson, Patricia Orr, Dale Keyes, and Kathy McKnight, some of whom are affiliated with the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution out in Tucson, Arizona, just published a very interesting article in Conflict Resolution Quarterly that you might want to take a look at. They looked at 52 cases from both U.S. federal agencies and some states to look at what makes ECR work. What are the factors that are important that get people over the finish line to an agreement? And Patricia Orr actually shared this graphic with me, so I could share it with you here today. Essentially, this was their framework. And what it boils down to is that to get to agreement reached, having agreements that are of high quality, and having working relationships improve, the intermediate variable is that you have the participants involved effectively engaged. Now, the things that seem to be important in getting to that point, as well as having an indirect effect on the agreement, are making sure that the appropriate parties are involved. So this speaks to making sure you have everyone in the room to have the conversation, even if it's not obvious who should be there. The skills and practices of mediators and facilitators are very, very important. And incorporating high quality and relevant information, which is another theme that I noticed in the CRS document. If the stakeholders at the table having a negotiation have relevant information, they're better able to get to these goals of agreements that are high quality and improving working relationships. It's only one study, not without limitations, but it's relatively new, and I thought I'd offer it up for the consideration of folks here today. What are the results of ECR? What do we get for the time and expense? Because sometimes it is an extra expense. It's process. It doesn't seem to add to the bottom line. It doesn't seem to get to the infrastructure that we're trying to create to solve these water conflicts. Well, sometimes we get agreements, and agreement rates in the research range everything from 61% to 91%, depending on the study. But that's not enough. Grantors, government agencies, other decision makers who are funding these type of activities, they want to know what we get as a result. And we remain in this field somewhat of a faith-based initiative. We don't have as much research as we'd like to back up the results of ECR that we'd like to see. Now, I happen to be a believer, and I happen to have the faith that this is important and useful work. But these other organizations oftentimes are looking for a different kind of good news in order to get to the outcome that they're looking for. So I'd like to share with you some work that I've been doing with, and the graphic here didn't work out, but with some colleagues, Andy Rowe of ARC Economics and Bonnie Colby of the University of Arizona and Mike Niemeyer from the great state of Oregon on trying, I think for the first time, to capture the economic and environmental results of using these kind of processes. And we have a model that's comparative, which is really, really important when you're doing this kind of evaluation research, to look at what would have happened otherwise. It's not enough simply to see what the results were of this process, but to try to make the comparison. So I'd like to share with you a bit of results from the work we've done. Out in Oregon, we had a handful of cases. These were all water cases. They dealt with hydroelectric issues, some fish stock issues, as well as water basin transfers. Not a large N, so we're really careful about generalizing the results. But what we found for 3 of the cases is that on an environmental index that we constructed, using these kinds of environmental effects, for 2 of the cases, we're able to do that comparison. It was better to use ECR. It was better to collaborate. It was better to work it out than to do whatever the alternative was. In these 2 cases, Pelton and Marmot, those were both hydroelectric relicensing issues, and the alternative there would have been either litigation or a standard administrative type process. Bonnie Colby actually took some of the information that we gathered as part of our evaluation for two of the cases, Umatilla, which was a water basin transfer case, and Pelton, which was a hydroelectric case, and we costed out the fish. We looked at how many more fish would be restored as a result of the agreement that the parties reached. And here we presented that here. It's for economists, it's sort of a benefit transfer method for folks that are familiar with that technique. But really, for the first time, we were able to capture these kinds of benefits from an ECR type process. Over at EPA, we did another sort of handful of case studies there on water cases again, and these were permitting cases and enforcement cases, because that's the nature of the work that EPA largely does. And once again, with one exception, we were able to show an improvement in environmental effects over both a 10-year time span and a 60-year time span. The one case looked like it probably went backward for a little bit, but ultimately it actually would catch up. This is forward thinking. It's a way of doing analysis that really hasn't been done before. It's a work in progress, and so but it is really the first time that someone has tried to capture these kind of benefits from using a decision-making process like ECR. We also, at the same time, looked in a rough way at the cost to the agency of using this process, just in terms of staff time. We couldn't get all the numbers from other folks that were involved. And we found that in 3 out of the 4 cases, there was a net savings on the part of the agency compared to the alternative process, which in this case would have been various forms of litigation that would have taken place. So I'd like to wrap up now with a few closing remarks, and in particular focus on some of my thoughts as a practitioner. I think, first of all, is the importance of carefully assessing a conflict or situation and doing so in a collaborative way with people. Because there's a secret here. It's not just this assessment that's separate somehow from the resolution process. It's part of the resolution process. You get people to a place where they're thinking about agreement, and they're trying to get small agreements along the way, which can help them in the collaboration that they need to do in the future. I think the CRS document speaks to this very well. Another thought is the importance and value, often overlooked, of professional conflict resolution expertise. I think despite the additional expense, it can offer a couple of things. First of all, one, it gives the substantive experts and decision makers a chance to do their job, to let someone else handle the procedural kinds of issues that can be really dicey and really challenging for folks, and let them focus on the things that they're best at. And second is breaking impasse. We see time and time again where mediators and facilitators can help people get past a really, really tough spot. ECR professionals can take on a range of roles. One of my favorite is the role of conflict coach. These are people who don't necessarily get up in the front of the room and with flip charts and whatever, but they're behind the scenes working with the decision makers who themselves don't want to give up control of the situation, but can benefit from a little help and advice along the way. And one last practice comment. I think an important contribution of conflict resolution, environmental conflict resolution as a whole, is to offer hope. Where people are involved in environmental conflict, they're in situations of structural inequity, they don't see a way out. And in these situations, some of the consequences can be quite dire, not only for local people, but for whole regions of the planet. And I think that ECR does offer a path forward in many cases. It's a different way of thinking about things that can help people get to a better place. It's not a panacea, of course, but I think it's a way that it can help show a way forward. In closing, as I reflect back on these 5 questions that I addressed about ripeness, goals, tipping points, process, and results, they strike me not only as a way of organizing a presentation, but almost a menu of questions that development workers and others can ask themselves when they're out in the field working on these kinds of very challenging issues. And perhaps would be of help to those of you that are involved in that directly. I want to thank you for your attention. I look forward to the rest of the panel conversation. I'll be glad to follow up with folks after if you have questions or comments about my presentation. Thank you.
I'm Tjip Walker. I'm with the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at U.S. Agency for International Development, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. Yeah, get rid of that. Yes. Oh, security alert. Okay. Again, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. It was intriguing that all three of the presenters today have at least one thing in common, it turns out, and that's that we've all been Peace Corps volunteers. I, however, had nothing to do with water and so forth. I was working on coffee cooperatives in Cameroon about 25 years ago. I too come at this issue primarily from the perspective as being an expert on conflict, rather than being an engineer or an expert on water or natural resource management. That doesn't mean that USAID doesn't, in fact, look at it from that particular perspective. And indeed, as I was preparing for these remarks, I was very impressed to see the amount of information that is available on our website that describes the various kinds of approaches that we take looking at very much the same question from the largely similar perspective to this book, which is from the standpoint of how do we develop water resources in a way that is environmentally sensitive and also pays attention to local social dynamics. But I too am going to sort of look at this question primarily from the standpoint of saying, well, what does the issue of sort of water and water development say for somebody, or the questions that are raised from the standpoint of somebody who is primarily looking at it from the issue of conflict. I too also want to commend CRS for taking on this particular topic. I think that organizations as a whole, I think the more that we all can collectively help our staffs, the staffs that we have, and the partners that we have to better integrate conflict sensitivity into ongoing development programming, the better off we're going to be. And I certainly see this new book as a welcome addition to that group of sort of conflict-sensitive guides. I'm going to be shameless about this and do a little bit of advertising of our own. We, too, USAID also has a number of natural resource-related toolkits that we call toolkits that also try to address similar kinds of issues. We have them on land, minerals, forests that deal on natural resources, a similar topic on livelihoods, and several others as well, all of which are, again, available on the USAID.gov website. But this whole question about how we can all do development a little bit more sensitively is a very important one. And again, I just want to congratulate CRS for taking on this very complex topic. And indeed, in many ways, there is really very, although we all almost take it for granted, there really is out there no more complex commodity or good out there than water, because it exists in a variety of different forms. We care about it for a lot of different purposes. It's important for everyone, and we depend upon it for survival. And for all of those reasons, it is in some ways almost unique. But in many other ways, it does in fact look a lot like other kinds of services or goods that are out there. And so what I want to frame my remarks around is essentially looking at this question of water from a conflict perspective, but looking at it from sort of saying, how is water similar to a lot of other goods that are and services that are out there, and how does it relate in that respect? Looking more narrowly at water from the standpoint of one of its more unique characteristics as a common pool resource, and what does that do in terms of looking at it from a conflict perspective. And then lastly, sort of looking more precisely at this question about some of the more unique characteristics of water from a conflict perspective. One of the other also just want to stress, again, similar to Professor Hall, was the fact that I, as a conflict expert, was very pleased to see the extent to which this book really does, in fact, take fully embrace sort of what we would consider currently as best practice when it comes to thinking about conflict sensitivity, conflict dynamics. The issue of assessment has already been mentioned, the emphasis on monitoring and evaluation, the need for engaging stakeholders in this particular process and negotiations, all very good. And I also would like to also draw your attention to the fact that CRS has another excellent resource out there. It's a book also published by written by John Lederach and some associates, called Reflective Peacebuilding. And if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's one of the best pieces of work that's out there. We use it extensively in our own internal training. But essentially sort of adopting this kind of perspective as a reflective peace builder. And I think reflection in any of the work that we do, particularly when we are working in societies outside our own, is particularly important. And I just think it's just a really remarkable resource that's out there. And thank CRS for putting it together. But back to water. And as I said, in many respects, water is similar to a lot of other goods and services, similar to health, education, and so forth. It is seen as a basic human need. It is something that people desperately want. It's one of the first things that people desire, and inevitably it is an issue around which conflicts arise. If we think about it in this particular context, I think that one of the things that comes to the forefront is the importance of governance. The research that has been done in looking at countries that are most at risk for violent conflict, the single most important issue that emerges from that work is the importance of governance. Countries that are more democratic, that are more participatory, generally speaking, are less at risk for violent conflict than those that have certain kinds of characteristics of democracy, but also at the same time do, in fact, either restrict rights, limit access to information, or otherwise control the situation. Of course, the most serious autocracies are also less likely to have violence, but for other reasons. But I think that what this suggests, and one of the reasons that this becomes particularly important, is that if you look for two reasons. One is that the way in which people are able to resolve their conflicts, the way they are able to sort of raise issues about access to water, and to see that they are in fact resolved in ways that are seen as generally fair and transparent, is through a political process of some kind. If that is absent to them, as was just recently suggested, then the prospects of resort to violence becomes that much more likely. So it is that ability to be able to figure out a way to manage this important resource in a way that is perceived of as broadly legitimate and effective that is really the critical question. So the issue we ultimately need to address is how can we create arrangements that allow individuals to perceive that the water resources that they wish to have access to are being managed in ways that are broadly seen as being effective and legitimate. Now, one of the challenges that we particularly face is that if you read this book or look elsewhere and you look at the countries that are where the water deficit is the most severe, and then you overlay that with countries in terms of their quality of governance, what you unfortunately see is that the countries where the deficit is the most severe are also those countries where the governance is the weakest. It also suggests those are the countries where conflict, generally speaking, is the most likely to happen. So we have this sort of conundrum of the fact that the places predominantly in Africa and to some extent in Latin America, whether we're talking about rivers, whether we're talking about water basins, whether we're talking about more arid lands, where we're talking more about wells, these are all the countries in that. And in fact, there's a map that's provided in the book that sort of looks at this question of overlay. So from a more of a macro global sense, we're sort of faced with a sort of a series of problems with certain countries and their overall level of governance, because it is their general inability, their fragility, that essentially prevents them from being able to not only manage their water resources, but a whole series of other goods and services as well. The second point I wanted to point out is that water, in most of its forms, can be classified as what is called a common pool resource, sometimes called a commons, and lends itself in the minds of many to sort of this tragedy of the commons. In other words, there's an incentive for people to essentially exploit it to the point where it essentially disappears. Now, one of the most important scholars to work on this is Elinor Ostrom, who, as most of you probably know, won a Nobel Prize a few months ago for her work on common pool resources and the management of those resources, and I was very fortunate to have as my PhD advisor at Indiana, has done some, I think, remarkable work on this particular topic, and shows, I think, fairly clearly that you don't necessarily run into a tragedy of the commons. You can, in fact, effectively manage these resources if certain kinds of conditions apply. Now, these conditions largely devolve down to to the general sort of point that they work effectively when those people who have a stake in that particular resource have the ability to meet together to establish rules that are then perceived of as fair, that can be enforced, and that can be adjudicated. In other words, that there's some kind of mechanism for them to resolve disputes as they move forward. So it essentially is a little miniature governance system that applies to that particular common pool resource. And that, I think, is a very hopeful argument to be made about the fact that local groups do, in fact, and have been proven over the centuries, to be able to manage these resources effectively if they are provided with the kind of enabling environment that allows them to essentially achieve those kinds of conditions that I just listed. The problem that you run into, and I think this example that was provided about the mayor and running you around on the motorcycle and so forth, is that we frequently find ourselves in environments in which we have sort of more patron-client type arrangements, where it's really important for sort of high-level people to be seen as taking responsibility and taking charge and dispensing favors hither and thither. And this is not a particularly kind environment for trying to create the kinds of procedures that you'd need to put in place for managing common pool resources effectively. And again, puts, I think, fair amount of stress, because these forms of sort of little decentralized, relatively decentralized and potentially overlapping governance arrangements for common pool resources are quite challenging to set up, and may in fact interfere with sort of as I said, sort of these larger governing processes that may be in place. That doesn't mean that it can't happen. It's just saying that our challenges are therefore, again, fairly severe, but then brings us back again to this governance question. And the last point I'd like to make is essentially sort of saying, well, there are certain kinds of characteristics about water that really are somewhat unique. And I think one of the most interesting things about it, I mean, is that one of the most valuable resources is river water. And rivers often cross jurisdictional boundaries, particularly between states. And you might think that this kind of upstream and downstream kinds of conflicts would be ones that would be rife for war and so forth. But one of the things I was particularly intrigued with is a table, or is a figure early in the document. I think it's on page 6, which sort of provides you with a bar graph of the kinds of issues surrounding transboundary river issues. And what I was intrigued to see is that most of them have actually been positive. And so one of the things that I think that particularly river and transboundary kinds of issues around water seem to sort of suggest to humans is the fact that we all are in this together, and it doesn't seem to provide a kind of a focusing kind of example of the fact that we do need to negotiate and come up with some kind of an agreement that allows all of us to have access to these kinds of resources. And I think that the fact that we've had this kind of success on that kind of scale on transboundary issues, and I think generally speaking in the area of conflict prevention, these transboundary agreements are sort of held out often as being one of the sort of singular examples of success of these kinds of agreements that could otherwise have been provoke conflicts, and even in many instances have led to more general forms of negotiations to resolve other kinds of issues as well. So with that, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that when it comes right down, when we sort of look at this issue, it really the role of governance in the system directly in terms of our local people in a position to be able to manage those resources. What is the nature of the governing system in the country in which these resources are found, and how readily does it essentially provide those kinds of enabling environment for the resources, for those resources to be managed, is crucial. And then finally, that we do in fact have opportunities, both looking at the small, in the case of being the examples of Eleanor Ostrom and her collaborators, in terms of identifying all of these various kinds of common pool resources that have been effectively managed by local organizations, but also at the large in terms of transboundary agreements. I do think it does give us some hope that under the right circumstances that we do have the ability to manage these effectively in ways that are perceived of generally as being effective and legitimate. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I thought all three of these presentations were super, and they gave different perspectives of this very important issue. Jason gave a passionate view of water-related conflicts from the field and surveyed a good part of the practice-oriented literature that affects or explains these conflicts. Will reviewed some of the research efforts and applications in water development activities, primarily in the U.S. context and those which affect large government institutions. Tjip surveyed the conflict-related characteristics of water and made the point that many of these characteristics are similar with those that occur in other basic human needs, such as education and health and so on. And he emphasized the importance of an enabling environment and governance. Now, before I turn to questions, I just want to make a little statement about what we, CRS, would like to get out of this. Our concerns are with the welfare, the dignity, the empowerment of people, especially the poorest of the poor in developing countries. And so to be effective, to do something useful there, we need to understand these issues. We need to share the insights we may get on these issues with others, yourselves, and we need to encourage more involvement in these development activities, encourage more working directly with the people to help them achieve their objectives. So what would we like from the CRS perspective, and I hope some of this will come out in your questions, although I don't want to tell you what questions to ask. Where do we go from here? And what issues in this area of water, conflict, cooperation need more investigation? Where should the development community, that's all of us, give priority? And of course, we hope to glean from this what should we, CRS, do on this critical subject. So with that, I will take questions. And what I'll do is take maybe 3 or 4 questions at a time and then turn to the panelists to respond to them. Yes?
Microphones that will be brought to them so that
Okay,
folks online
yes. We have a roving microphone.
Don't identify themselves.
Please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Hugh McElrath, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, but I'm not a water expert. I would invite Jason Gehrig to dilate on his remarks about privatization. Last time I looked, it was about recapitalizing or capitalizing large-scale water projects. What was wrong with the way it was done where you saw it? Was it just the terms of the contract, or do you think privatization actually has irremediable problems? And the other thing is, I'd love to hear the story about the bicycle race.
Other question over here.
Thank you. Tony Kolb, USAID Urban Programs Team. I just wanted to raise slightly to the defense of a former colleague of mine, Kristen Komeves, whose paper you referenced there in terms of her analysis of the pro-poor impacts of the privatization in Bolivia. Kristen actually, working with myself and many others with the World Bank, actually were very instrumental in including poverty impact assessments as a standard procedure in World Bank loan issuance now, especially for infrastructure programs. So her work has really been involved in getting the voices of the poor expressed in ways that matter to the decision makers in the big organizations. So I just wanted to clarify that. The question I had was an insight on the privatization issue. The architects of this push at the World Bank, one of the reasons that has been articulated to me that I don't think is very widely known, one of the reasons that they pushed privatization was that they were sort of stuck in this low ebb of stasis, as in Dr. Hall's graph, I think, where there was this inequality that was not being overcome. There was really no conflict associated with it. The poor were not being served by good water supply in cities. And the privatization push was to bring it to light and to move towards conflict, which it did in many, many countries, and to create the conditions for trying to move up this continuum. So I'd like to know from Jason's experience in Bolivia, if, since you were there in some of this post-conflict or conflict period, do you think that actually was a constructive process, and has it resulted in change? And if not, or if it was imperfect, what maybe could we have done to make sure that that push up the line could have been more constructive?
Thank you. Can I take one from the back there? Yes.
My name is Shannon. I work with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. And one of the things LaRouche always references is Genesis chapter 1, that mankind is made in God's image, so that human beings have this creative power of the mind to make scientific discoveries and technological improvements so we can always support a larger population and improve living conditions. And one of the concerns I have is that there was a lot of talk of conflict management, as if the assumption is already made that water is a scarce resource and we won't have enough. And so we have to figure out how to manage conflicts. What I want to know is why we aren't instead talking about nuclear power and desalinization of water on an industrial level. And instead of digging wells in Africa, why we aren't talking about digging canal systems and modern irrigation. Because we could actually green the deserts of Africa the same way that we've greened some of the deserts in the United States, not to mention the rest of the solar system. So that's my first question. And then the second is, you talked some about political structures, and nobody's mentioned the worldwide economic crisis that we're in. And LaRouche has suggested that we have to actually replace the current economic system we have that seems to keep the poor poor, and we actually have to base our system on this power of the human mind for technological and scientific transformation and the development of all peoples. So those are my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me turn to the panelists who may or may not be able to answer your good questions. Who would like to go first? Who should go first? Jason, two were directed directly to you.
Well, first of all, I'm certainly not an expert on privatization, but I've lived it firsthand. My neighbors have as well. I think to me it seems kind of dangerous, this idea, if I understand correctly, of trying to incite conflict and get beyond some stagnant situation. The Cochabamba water war actually came to a head when a 17-year-old was shot dead by a military sniper trained by the School of Americas. I don't think we want to be going through that kind of process. Now, I'm the last person, I've lived it, I've seen it, that often, state entities have their political militants thrown in there who know less about water or how to manage something than their ties to the party in power. Now, that's one extreme. The other extreme, the privatization. I think with the El Alto La Paz model, what they showed is very little outside capital was actually infused. That was generally gained through those connection fees that were raised so high. Because where I lived on the outskirts of El Alto, this is the high barren area. These people are incredible water conservers. And so there was actually pressure on them to use more water. In other words, it didn't make sense from a profit maximizing point of view to run infrastructure 10 miles out to the outskirts of the El Alto, where the majority of the indigenous live, if there are only, because of the abundant water supply at the time with the snow caps, they couldn't justify, high water rates. The rates themselves were not that expensive. But how do you make your money back on the cost of that infrastructure to get it out there? Well, you have to do that through the connection fees. Now, they had different multilateral lending and so forth, and probably some investment on the private side, but it certainly didn't resolve the problem there. So what on the state side, again, some of the issues are the corruption inside these entities, with some of the unions and so forth. how to break free of that. And what they were proposing was kind of an alternative. Tjip was saying, getting those users involved in that governance, having their voice, and having enough of them where, 2 or 3, if it's a 3 or 4 person body, a couple of them could be too easily bought off. You get enough people in there that are really looking out for the interests of themselves and for their fellow neighbors, and things can happen. So what we were seeing is kind of an alternative of promotion, perhaps cooperatives in the southern Cochabamba area, because once the water development, the privatization didn't work, the public funds still there in Cochabamba, it was an issue of a lack of water supply. They didn't have access to international credit for many years as somewhat of a punishment. So where do they go? These small-scale cooperatives is one solution. So I think we have to be creative. I think we do have to have a balanced perspective. I come from that view of the impoverished, so you can see I'm a little bit geared to one way or another, but that's not to say I'm blind to some of the issues, with the public sector. So, and I think there's something to be said about having the integrity to look at the structure system as it is, the socioeconomic systems of the world, and we just need to keep working at that. Otherwise we're just doing a Band-Aid work. Yeah, sorry, I wish I was more articulate, but we'll leave it at that.
You're not going to tell your bicycle story?
Oh, bicycle story. The Doble Copacabana, yes, Bolivia's international bicycling event, once a year. This goes from La Paz, Copacabana. It has to pass through a community of San Pablo de Tequín on the shores of Lake Titicaca. We had about 200 families there that we had installed a distribution system. Everything had gone really well. The funding entity gave about 15 grand, the local municipality another 15 grand. The community members themselves had coughed up about $2,000 for materials. We got that thing built, and we were still shy about $3,000, and it sat there for about 3 or 4 months. We didn't have the money to buy the pump, and so the people were getting very frustrated. We didn't have a mechanism for change orders. I work with the public water sector here. That's part of reality. And so the people realized that they had once a year they would have leverage to force our hand. And that was the day before the international bicycling event was to pass through their community. So it's no fun, let me tell you, being in front of 100 community members who are quite livid. It's the night before. You're hearing on the radio reports as to whether or not your negotiations are going well. And so we were able to pull it off around midnight. Basically a cost-sharing arrangement is what we agreed upon. But just one of various incidents we had in my life. So.
Any other comments from the panel?
The only thing I would mention is the fact that if I've learned anything in my career, it's the fact that that the more complex a problem you're trying to deal with, the presumption is that the solution itself is also going to have to be complex. It may very well be that technology can be a useful factor in terms of trying to resolve some of these issues, but to think that we're going to sort of invent our way out of these problems, I just simply don't agree. And I think that we need to sort of think also about how we are continuing to use the resources that we do have to be good stewards. I think that's also, if you will, part of the responsibility in Genesis, is this question of agriculture in particular. It uses a substantial proportion of the water resources, and I do think that if we are thinking about how to increase to use our technology, I think it's I would think in terms of trying to figure out how we can develop an agricultural system that uses water much more efficiently.
Questions? Back here.
Thank you. Karen Kirchnock with the Nature Conservancy. I've been trying to think of how to frame this the best, because I don't want to frame it as a conflict, but it's somewhat of like ideological differences. And where I come from is the perspectives of how do you bridge the divide between the development agenda and the conservation agenda? We've seen this in the water sector where so much focus is on water service delivery, but not thinking about in the long-term sustainability. So even like the farming that's happening, I mean, it's basically draining aquifers. In Peru, we've been working, one of our partners, on asparagus farms there, which was a development project, and yes, has brought livelihoods and income, but they're basically depleting the water table about 8 feet per year. And if you look at pictures of it, it's basically these green farms in a desert that are just not going to be there that long because there won't be the water to sustain it. So one of the things that we tackle with is how do we bridge that divide between looking at it from a development perspective, but a long-term sustainability perspective. Even here with the U.S. legislation, with the Paul Simon for Water for Poor Act, the Water for World Act, you know, how do we get in this notion of watershed protection and conservation is something good for people in the long term and also short term, but you'll have long-term and short-term service delivery if you have those watersheds there. So, you know, it's how do, I guess I don't want to paint it as a conflict, but really how do we bridge that divide of understanding that if you have healthy freshwater ecosystems, then you can also have healthy people.
Thank you. Another question? In the back?
Hi, Dan Ross with Harambee International Development. We've been involved with developing clean water resources in northern Uganda, where the war they had there for 20 years closed a lot of the water resources they had there. And I was just trying to see what's your experience with the NGOs and others that are developing boreholes and water wells in some of the conflict areas to aid the people who have been adversely harmed by the conflicts, and then partnering with other organizations within the room or that they could develop resources to avoid future conflicts.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Jeff?
I'll do it quickly here to save us a moment. Jeff DeBelco with Wilson Center. Again, thank you, panelists. Excellent presentation. I had 2 points that maybe folks would like to reflect on, but don't feel obliged to. One, I guess, would be that we flag the value or the potential value of the interdependence around water and sanitation that we have across communities, families, countries, and try to explore proactively the prospect for cooperation that might flow from that interdependence to help solve larger conflicts where the water and sanitation issue may be not a problem or not the focus of the problem or not what got the conflict started. So I'm thinking, for example, and he's going to be in town next week in a forum here at the center on Wednesday afternoon, Gidon Bromberg and the folks at Friends of the Earth Middle East, with their Good Water Neighbors program, have paired Palestinian Israeli communities, Israeli and Jordanian communities around sanitation issues where kids get sick on both sides of the border if the sanitation's not treated, and use that logic of interdependence that need to cooperate to do school to school, mayor to mayor, and then play that cooperation for its own benefits, but also use it to try to improve the relationship in the larger conflict that we can agree at the heart is not about the sanitation issue. So I think we want to capture that, and it's, again, as I indicated up front, a strength of the report that it's not just about threats and arm waving, it's also then making that transition to what do we do about it. And then a second point would be in that category of where to in future is that how do all these issues change in a warmer world? The climate change dimension, obviously a big part of what we have to do with the climate change issue, if we look at it in a security context, is bring it down to individual implications for individual resource sector types. And so what does it mean for water? It's going to be a lot more in some places, a lot less in others. It's going to be more episodic and more, lots of change, all of which will affect these dynamics. I think certainly first step would be doing in part what this report does and what it's facilitated for us here today, which is getting folks coming to these issues from different perspectives to talk. Because I think there's an assumption that we know each other's languages and the tools and mechanisms. I think from learning a lot presentations today, I saw that there's a lot that I have to learn, and I know it's not easy, but it's necessary. It's not easy to measure and give that impact because they're process indicators. Much of it is getting in the room and learning from one another, but nevertheless of high value. And I think I've started the presentation here again to watch the pictures. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. Well, we have some juicy issues here to look at. The bridging the gap between conservation and the development agenda, the issue of what is the effect of boreholes and wells on water tables and the effects on the people in northern Uganda. And now the looming question of how does climate change affect the work that we're doing? Who would like to jump into this?
Oh, heck, I'll give it a shot. Big issues, obviously. I wanted to take on a couple of them, the questions that came up, in probably a fairly superficial way, but maybe it'll be of use. And this is, first of all, healthy people versus healthy water, this distinction. I think the first starting point is to reframe it. I think as long as we continue to see this dichotomy, we're going to continue to have the problem. The second thing I think there is looking for the examples of where it has worked. There must be examples, and finding them and figuring out how they're similar to other situations that may exist out there. I think that's critical, particularly when you're trying to get to decision makers in, let's say, the U.S. federal government, to be able to show what sorts of things have worked and why the reframing that you're trying to do makes sense. In terms of issues of climate change, obviously a hot topic, so to speak, for a lot of us these days, there I think what I expect to see in the absence of some very smart interventions and action, frankly, on the part of the various governments and international community, is a lot of places in the world are going to be facing these kind of issues that haven't been facing them before. And up to and including these United States. I think we're going to be looking at situations where, as was suggested before, we don't have the governance structures in place to deal with them. Some of those are already starting to happen here in this country. And it's important that we try to get ahead of those to the extent we can, begin to think about them, begin to put strategies in place so that we don't find ourselves dealing with the consequences later on.
Any other comments?
Well, I mean, just to sort of pick up a little bit on the last observation. I mean, I think that that one of the strengths of the book, and I think it's been repeated several times, is the fact that while there's no question that that water has been the source, has been and the object of violent conflicts in the past, there isn't necessarily an inherent reason to believe that just because you happen to have a water resource that you're necessarily going to have conflict associated with it. And I think that that's important to sort of bear that in mind, even as we begin to think about the greater stresses that will be being placed on some of these water resources as we experience the greater warming of the climate. I agree that it's going to result probably in issues that haven't been thought of before. But I think it's also important, and one of the issues that our office has been examining is sort of to look at this sort of larger question about what are the long-term conflict implications of global warming. And not to say we're the only ones that have done so, but the work that we have commissioned basically argues for maintaining a bit more of a nuanced kind of an approach to saying, yes, there are these greater risks. They do, as I mentioned before, happen to largely global warming is likely, according to the climate models and so forth, seems to be having greater an impact in countries that are currently not very well governed and are at risk for violence. But on the other hand, let's also not discount the abilities of local communities and their capacities for resilience to be able to find ways to manage these changes as well. And so one of the things looking forward, I think that we are interested in examining more deeply is as we begin to already see examples where there is climate-related change, and it can be climate-related change that is either of a natural sort or man-made, as our representative from mentioned about the asparagus farms, and the question of how is it that communities are in fact adapting? What does seem to predispose those kinds of communities to being able to manage those conflicts by themselves? What kinds of internal resources, traditional practices, local level governance arrangements, and dispute resolution mechanisms, and so forth seem to be of particular use in trying to resolve those conflicts, and what seems to predispose people more to look for conflict. We think that if we can get that kind of sort of understanding, that will put all of us in a better understanding to say, on a much more localized basis, where are these risks the greatest. But I also agree, I think there are these tensions between development and conservation and development and conflict and so forth, and I think the only thing that this suggests to us is that we do need to look at these issues in a long-term perspective. We may not have had a conflict over the asparagus farms in the past, but if you tell those people who are depending on that now as a livelihood that you're going to take it away from them, I imagine that's going to be a source of conflict. So I think that we do need to be attentive to it, and I think the only solution is essentially one that sort of looks more effectively at this question of what are the longer-term impacts, and of course that requires us as all of us as part of the development community to, again, to take a much more longer-term perspective as we think about our projects and our programs.
Let me take advantage of my role here as the moderator to try to address the question on Uganda and the effect of boreholes and wells and how this is affecting NGOs and their work. To tell the truth, we really don't know well what the problem is. We can sense that conflicts are occurring, that disagreements occur within communities, between administrative regions, but we do not have a good systematic way of trying to capture this information and have a way to act on it. We need to develop better ways of monitoring, better ways of staying with development projects after the project is finished, so that one can see what is the evolving dynamic that occurs. So we are in a mode now of trying to determine what question should we be asking in these areas. Your question is good. I'm sorry I can't say that we have the answer to it, because we don't. And I think very few organizations have a good understanding of how to deal with conflicts, particularly at the very local level, between people, between households, between communities. And let me give one example. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, you can't be at this front table unless you're a Peace Corps volunteer. Many years ago, when I was in Tanzania working with the Water Development Department, the department put up a windmill at the interface between two tribal areas in the north of Tanzania. Of course, we had no idea of what conflict mitigation or resolution was, and conflicts arose between these two ethnic groups over who would control the windmill. So they solved the problem their own way. They took it down. I mean, the local people took the windmill down. That way they resolved it, and everybody was equal again. That's not a method that I think we want to recommend for the future, but that's I would call a catastrophic outcome when conflicts are not understood and addressed. Could we get some more questions or comments?
Yes, before you go, I mean, just if I could just add on this issue about the boreholes and so forth. I mean, I think that it's an example of a more general issue about trying to bring development types activities into post-conflict environments. And the only thing I would add is that I don't think that there's anything inherent about those post-conflict environments that suggests that you shouldn't try to do the best practices that we've been, that are talked about, that are embedded in here. So it begins with even though it may be difficult, a good assessment of what's going on, and I think an awareness and a commitment to what's generally called do no harm principles. In other words, if you are concerned that doing so may in fact raise risks, then don't do it. Don't build the windmill in the first place. But I think under the circumstances that it is indeed possible, generally, if you involve the local communities in the discussion around the issues about where to build it and what its purposes would be, there have been numerous examples of which that can in fact be a useful activity, and that these kinds of efforts that sort of try to mobilize communities and to try to help use a resource like a well as a sort of a focal point to begin to get conversation, discussion, and ultimately reconciliation started is a relatively well-established practice that I'm sure CRS and others use in terms of trying to help war-torn societies get back on their feet again.
Okay. Thank you. Yes?
Should I wait for the microphone or just use my...
It's coming. It's coming.
Thank you. David Mickle with the Stimson Center here in Washington. I'd like to call on Tjip and William to use their experience of conflict resolution and as mediators to talk about the question of finding the right forum or institutions to support or enact environmental conflict resolution. And I'm thinking particularly of transboundary issues where there might not be an arena, appropriate arena for bringing the parties together. If you think of a river system like the Ganges-Brahmaputra, where there are arrangements between India and its neighbors, but that don't include all of the riparians, or of the Mekong, where one of the most important actors, China, is not part of the Mekong River Commission, or even within national boundaries where different administrative agencies, different federal states have different responsibilities, or finally, even in cases where the institutions themselves might be part of the problem, which was the case in Bolivia, or in instances where there's serious state corruption. What should the mediators or those who would like to promote conflict resolution, how should they choose the forum, or what can they do to promote or enable one where an appropriate institutional setting doesn't exist? And then a somewhat related question directed a little bit more towards Jason. There's a portion of the book which talks about Catholic social teaching, and I wonder if you could say something about how to call on or make use of other values in the society that may not be embodied in a particular organization or institution, but which still constitute a kind of shared language or environment for conflict resolution. Jeff, do you want to start with? Tjip, why don't you begin?
I'd like to defer to Will on that first.
Fair enough. It's a great question. We often talk in this business about finding neutral third parties. That's kind of the lingo that we use. And I've become sort of not enamored with that over the years because who's neutral? We've all got a perspective on things. Institutions all have a perspective. As is noted in the CRS document, you need to get in tune with that before you even try to engage in these kind of efforts. So I think one of the most important things that the stakeholders do in the early phases of working on conflict resolution is to help figure out who that person is, or organization is, if it's an institutional context. It's really the person that's acceptable, that meets the needs of folks, and that in of itself can involve the kind of social analysis that is advocated here in the CRS document, and I was talking about as well. It's a negotiation about a negotiation. It's about figuring out what the shape of the table is going to be, and it can take time. But I know in my work with folks, we spend the time to do that when it's necessary. Sometimes someone's holding out their shingle as a mediator, you bring them in, and it works just fine. There are times, though, when it's maybe as much about trying to figure out who that institutional or individual type person is as anything else. So I encourage taking the time, doing the conflict assessment, knowing that you may not in fact be that person ultimately serving that role, but you can help get the stakeholders to a place where they've got someone that they can work with.
I don't really have anything to add to that.
I'll just say a word on the transboundary, and David would be a good person to answer this question too. As he's asking, it's a bit of a setup because he's got plenty of good answers for it as well. But I think on the transboundary side, just a couple ad hoc reflections. One, we shouldn't forget it, and we shouldn't put it as a lower priority. Investing in institutions around transboundary water as a lower priority because the benefits are not as obvious, immediate, and direct as expenditures that might go very directly to a specific project around water and sanitation, where you can count wellheads, count people who are getting access, and kind of against that Millennium Development Goal indicator, that those things can flow from the, again, investment in process, long-term, big stakes, all those issues, including some of the ecosystem service issues that Karen brought up, come from that. I think it is also something that the neutrality question, although as pointed out, is difficult if ever can be achieved, that we have bilateral options and multilateral options, and I think investing in the multilateral as the face forward in that is constructive, and that's one of the places we, as sitting in the United States, we're here to help, and we can solve all problems. It may be the kind of instance where it's best done through that intermediary because of the politics of a given basin. You come in and you cause problems for yourself just by how it's perceived. And then finally, that our timelines for supporting these kind of efforts fundamentally are mismatched with the time that this takes. So the example that the bank set for facilitating the Nile Basin Initiative, where Wolfenson said, we'll give you 20 years on the process, and we up front will tell you that we'll give you that, because we're not going to solve this in some 2-year time cycle that we like to do development assistance in. That's a fantasy, right? And so if we could, in that respect, and there are all sorts of reasons at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue why that longer time frame is more difficult, but if we could get real in terms of understanding what can be achieved under what timelines, that I think would be a tremendous step forward.
Any other comments on this issue? Jason?
Well, referring to the shared values and the ecumenical dialogue, I think there are tremendous opportunities to bring people together around water and to have the religious leaders come together, have that dialogue. So often there are shared values there. I was just glancing at some of these issues under the Catholic social teaching, right to water, the common good, integrity of creation, as we were talking earlier, the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, righteous indignation. These are hardly just Catholic values. These are in many ways core values that I think opposing groups can come together, and when they see that the religious leaders can have these kind of conversations and agreements, I think that's a tremendous example, role model for their communities to maybe move forward in their relationships together. So, thanks.
Just adding a word to that, one would also think that in countries it would also be very helpful for the external agency which is trying to stimulate change to understand what are the motivating values, philosophies, and beliefs of that culture and try to bring those forward. Because as Jason said, the core issues between peoples there are very little changes between them. So if one can bring out how these issues are articulated by particular societies, particular cultures, it may be a great tool in mitigating conflicts that would otherwise arise. More questions now. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Colleen Beck. I'm from Population Connection. I wanted to bring up the topic of women's empowerment and population growth. Basically, the idea that there's only so much water on Earth and there is a capacity to how many humans that water can support. And that being said, how Jason mentioned how 50% of the developing world, being women, are usually the ones directly affected and using the water. So I wanted to know what you had to say about that topic, but also how there must be solutions in women's empowerment, for example, and how that can cause controversy itself. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Another question? Yes.
My name is Brother David Andrews, and I'm here representing Food and Water Watch. And thank you for the reference to it here in the booklet. It's a wonderfully done booklet. It's very complex in handling the issues. One could just take Catholic social teaching and look at that section by itself in terms of policy implications, which may well include the peacebuilding, but might include a more robust focus on the right to water, for example. In the last year, I was an advisor to the President of the General Assembly of the UN, so very involved with food and water issues at the United Nations, and saw how impacted the UN itself is as a body, trying to implement things like the right to water in a context that's politically very challenging. So my question really is, apart from the on-the-ground peace-building kind of agenda, which I affirm, there are a lot of other issues that one could take out of this by way of advocacy. One would be getting the United States to look more with greater appreciation at the right to water, which you kind of imply. But I'm just wondering, are there other unfinished policy pieces that if you had the comprehensive focus that it kind of indicates that you'd like to see fleshed out more at some future work on water?
Okay, let's address these two questions. Actually, it's three questions. One was on encouraging women's empowerment, another on the effects of population growth and the fact that water is a limited resource, and then the question of, are there other policy issues that need more working out with regard to this issue? Panel?
I give a crack at this issue of women. First of all, I notice we're all white males up here speaking, and I'm sure some of the others in the room have noticed that too. In our development efforts, we would try different attempts at bringing the women into the roles. We'd always form drinking water committees. They would gather the tariffs after we left and coordinate the construction. And at times, we try different approaches. Sometimes we put it as a requirement. We kind of try to use our leverage to force it. We said, we want at least one woman on this drinking water committee. Well, some communities would respond by just, doing it on paper. Sure, we can meet that requirement. Others, sometimes we noticed that the communities that were closer to the urban areas, where the people often have 1 foot in the city, 1 foot in the rural areas, some of those perhaps traditional values that may not be so, how do you put it? Not all values or not all cultural aspects are perhaps all that healthy for their society. So in some communities, we actually found that the women were having that role, and often because they were trusted with the funds more than the men. The men might succumb to a little temptation to go out and buy a bunch of beer for their buddies or compadres. And so that was something we continuously worked at. I can't say that we came up with the solution. We always encouraged it. The location of the tap stands are always the role of the women because they would be the ones to go fetch it. But in that nature, on the population issue, I think from a Catholic perspective, I think we in the church need to look at that issue as an issue of life, the natural world, our human life. Obviously, I'm not a bishop at being able to speak of some of those more difficult terms, but the fact is population growth is going to be a huge factor with increasing water scarcity, amongst others, increasing affluence in the world as well. So we need to be able to address those issues. And again, that's why I thank CRS for being able to incorporate these various aspects that are very difficult and not leaving any of them as taboo. Unfortunately, no easy answers, but I think the important thing is we have those conversations and we frame this within a concept of life, within human life and a healthy reality, a natural world in which we're in.
Any other comments?
Well, I would just sort of underscore what was just said in some sense on the issue on gender. I mean, I think that that if you sort of accept the general principle that you want to involve in the governance of the resource those people who are actually making most use of it, then obviously in their in the roles of women, that to the extent that women are involved in essentially keeping the home and providing water for cooking and for bathing and so forth, then obviously they would need to be involved. Of course, it does in fact run into sometimes these issues about resources, payments and all the rest of it. But again, I think there are if you go into a situation with the expectation that what you're really trying to ultimately understand is who uses the water and how, and try to involve them, and then I do think again, there's no end to human ingenuity in terms of trying to figure out ways in which you can in fact involve those people in those processes. You may have two committees, one that handles the money and one that sort of provides sort of, if you will, technical advice. So I think there are ways, but I think that it's very I think it's a pretty universal characteristic about how central women and are to resolving this issue, because in fact they are the primary users of the resource.
Yeah, I'd like to address the question about other policy things that might be done. One in particular relates, I think, to a question that we had earlier as well about transboundary issues and having appropriate convening type organizations and institutions. I'm a big believer that you need to match the forum to the fuss. We need a range of different options for dealing with these environmental conflict situations. One in particular that came to my attention a while back that really resonated was Ambassador John McDonnell and some others have been working on trying to get an environmental mediation, environmental conflict resolution unit started up at the UN. And I'm not going to suggest that the UN can be the forum for everything, but it would be an additional option that folks would have to turn to for dealing with some of these kind of very difficult issues.
Good, thank you. We have time for just one more question. If somebody has a good sort of comprehensive question that pulls things together, I'd like to hear it. This is not a quiz. You won't be graded. Anyone? Well, in that case, let me thank you all for coming and participating in this forum with us. We appreciate you being here. I think your very presence shows how important you and your organizations think this issue of water conflict and cooperation is. It's critically important. Water's a limited resource, and the demand is growing all the time, and we have to find ways to work with it, share it equitably, and deal with our brothers and sisters around the world. We have taken from this meeting a lot of good ideas, and I hope they will help to nurture our work in CRS, and if by some good fortune you get some ideas from it and it helps you along, that's very good too. With that, I would like to thank Jeff DeBelko and his colleagues here at the Woodrow Wilson Center for their very kind hospitality in hosting this meeting and providing these good facilities for us. It's been great, and this is a wonderful forum to try to reach out to all of you. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at CRS, Ken Hackett, our president, our Tricia Broglie on the board, and the other members of CRS that are here. And I'd like to make particular note of the people that have worked particularly on this water and conflict issue. My colleague in water, Chris Saramet, and Tom Bammett, who is the senior Peacebuilding advisor for CRS, and the woman who, from the CRS standpoint, put it all together, Toisha Powell, who made sure that all the T's were dotted and the I's were crossed. So with that, thank you very much. And go well.